In the sweltering haze of a June evening in 2018, Los Angeles sprawled beneath a sky bruised with the last traces of daylight. Edward Wilson, a 40-year-old mechanic, sat alone in his cramped apartment in Compton, a neighborhood where the hum of distant traffic mingled with the occasional wail of sirens. His life had settled into a predictable rhythm, much like the steady turn of a wrench in his calloused hands. Each day followed the same pattern: long hours at the auto shop, where grease stained his fingers and the scent of motor oil clung to his clothes. Solitary dinners of reheated takeout, eaten in silence at a chipped formica table, and the monthly ritual of transferring alimony payments to the bank account of his ex-wife, Sarah. The divorce, finalized 7 years earlier, had carved a hollow space in his chest, a void he had learned to live with but never quite filled. Yet despite the distance between them, Edward remained steadfast in his duty to support his 6-year-old daughter, Kayla, even though their interactions were limited to a single, strained visit each year. Those visits, brief and formal, left him with an ache he couldn't name, but he clung to the belief that providing for Kayla was his responsibility, a tether to the family he had once dreamed of. Edward's apartment was a small, dimly lit space, its walls adorned with little more than a few faded posters of classic cars and a single-frame photograph of Kayla, her smile frozen in time from her 5th birthday. The furniture was sparse: a worn couch, a coffee table cluttered with empty coffee mugs, and a narrow bed that creaked under his weight. The air conditioner rattled in the window, doing little to combat the oppressive heat that seeped through the walls. On this particular evening, Edward sat at his desk, a second-hand piece he'd salvaged from a thrift store, its surface scarred with scratches and coffee rings. His laptop, an outdated model that whirred loudly when powered on, glowed with the soft light of an open email. The message was from a genetic testing company, one he had impulsively signed up for months earlier, driven by a vague curiosity about his ancestry. He had sent in a DNA sample, expecting little more than a breakdown of his heritage, perhaps a confirmation of roots he already suspected. Instead, the email delivered a revelation that struck like a hammer against glass. The results stated in cold clinical terms that Edward was not the biological father of Kayla. The words blurred on the screen as his eyes traced them again and again, searching for some error, some misprint that would undo the truth. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the desk, the wood cool against his sweating palms. For 7 years, he had built his life around the belief that Kayla was his, that the sacrifices he made, the alimony payments that ate into his meager savings, the nights spent wondering what kind of father he could have been, were for his daughter. Now that foundation crumbled, leaving him suspended in a void of betrayal. His mind raced back to the years of his marriage, sifting through memories he had buried deep. Sarah's late nights at work, her evasive answers when he asked where she'd been, the way her laughter had grown distant, like a song fading into static. He had dismissed those moments as the strains of a failing marriage, but now they took on a sharper edge, each one a piece of a puzzle he hadn't wanted to solve. Edward rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate, as if the weight of the truth pressed against his shoulders. He crossed the room to a small wooden drawer in the corner, its handle loose from years of use. Inside, beneath a stack of unpaid bills and old receipts, lay a shoebox filled with photographs from a life that no longer felt like his own. He sifted through the images, snapshots of happier times, of him and Sarah at a beach barbecue, of their wedding day under a canopy of fairy lights. His fingers paused on a particular photo, one he hadn't looked at in years. It showed Sarah at a friend's party, her arm linked with a man Edward had met only once, a man whose easy smile and confident posture had irritated him even then. Raymond Cook, Sarah's old friend from college, had been a fleeting presence in their lives, but the memory of him now burned in Edward's mind. The photograph captured a moment of familiarity between them, a closeness that Edward had chosen to ignore at the time, chalking it up to nostalgia or harmless flirtation. Now the image felt like evidence, a silent accusation that confirmed the suspicions he had suppressed for so long. The apartment was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioner and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Edward stood frozen, the photograph clutched in his hand, its edges creasing under his tightening grip. His chest tightened with a mix of emotions: anger, sharp and searing, at Sarah's deception, grief for the daughter he had believed was his, and a deeper, more insidious pain, the realization that his life had been shaped by a lie. He set the photograph down and paced the room, his heavy footsteps echoing against the linoleum floor. Outside, the city glittered with a million lights, each one a reminder of the world moving forward while he remained trapped in the wreckage of his past. He stopped at the window, staring out at the sprawling expanse of Los Angeles, its neon glow a stark contrast to the darkness settling within him. Sleep eluded him that night. He lay on his bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling where cracks spiderwebbed across the plaster. His thoughts churned, replaying the email, the photograph, the years of payments that now felt like theft. He imagined confronting Sarah, demanding answers, but the thought of her cold, dismissive demeanor, the same one she'd worn during their divorce, only fueled his anger. By the time the first rays of dawn crept through the blinds, Edward had made a decision. He couldn't let this betrayal go unanswered. He needed to know the full extent of Sarah's deception, to uncover how deeply her lies had run. He rose and retrieved an old leather-bound notebook from the drawer, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Inside, written in Sarah's neat handwriting, was her address in Pasadena, a detail he had kept from their last correspondence. He traced the words with his finger, feeling the weight of his resolve solidify. The truth, whatever it cost, would be his. He would find it, no matter where it led. Edward's resolve hardened in the days following his discovery, and he began to shadow Sarah's life with a quiet, methodical determination. He requested a week of leave from the auto shop, citing vague family matters to his supervisor, who nodded without pressing for details. With cash from his savings, he rented a nondescript gray sedan from a small lot on the edge of Compton, choosing a vehicle that blended seamlessly into the city's endless stream of traffic. Its faded upholstery and faint smell of cigarette smoke suited his purpose. It was forgettable, invisible, a ghost among cars. Each morning he drove the 40-minute route to Pasadena, a suburb where manicured lawns and pastel houses stood in sharp contrast to the grit of his own neighborhood. Sarah's home, a tidy single story with a white picket fence and blooming magnolias in the front yard, seemed to mock him with its picture-perfect calm. It was the kind of life Edward had once imagined for himself, a life stolen by her betrayal, now lived by another man. He parked a block away, slouched low in the driver's seat, his eyes fixed on the house. Sarah lived there with Raymond, the man from the old photograph, whose presence now loomed large in Edward's mind. Through the sedan's tinted windows, he watched their routines unfold with a precision that both fascinated and infuriated him. Each morning, Sarah and Raymond emerged together, her in a neatly pressed blouse and him in a tailored jacket, climbing into a sleek black SUV before driving off to their respective jobs. In the afternoons, Raymond often picked up Kayla from the nearby elementary school, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder as they walked to the car. Edward's chest tightened at the sight of the girl, her braided hair bouncing as she skipped along, unaware of the lie that had shaped her existence. Every glimpse of their domestic ease, the way Sarah leaned into Raymond as they laughed, the way they moved as a unit, deepened the wound of Edward's betrayal. It wasn't just the marriage they had taken from him. It was the very essence of his identity as a father, a provider, a man who had believed in the promises they once shared. Determined to understand the depth of their deception, Edward turned to his old contacts in Compton, men who lingered in the corners of bars and auto shops, where information flowed as freely as cheap beer. Over a few drinks at a dimly lit tavern, he learned that Raymond worked as a logistics manager for a shipping company, overseeing truck routes across the state. Sarah, meanwhile, held a steady job as an administrator at a local medical clinic, her days filled with paperwork and polite smiles. Their lives appeared stable, almost enviably so, but Edward's keen eyes caught subtleties others might have missed. During his stakeouts, he noticed how Sarah's gaze darted nervously when she stepped outside, as if she sensed an unseen watcher. Raymond, too, carried a tension in his posture, his grip on Sarah's hand just a fraction too tight, his smile a touch too forced. Edward began to wonder if they suspected his discovery, if they feared the truth he now held. The thought gnawed at him, fueling his suspicion that their perfect life was built on a fragile lie, one he was determined to shatter. Late one night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Edward made a bolder move. He parked the sedan 2 streets away from Sarah's house, pulling a dark hoodie over his head and slipping a small toolkit into his pocket. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sounds the rustle of palm trees and the distant hum of a sprinkler. His hands, steady from years of working on engines, moved with practiced ease as he approached the garage attached to Sarah's home. The side door's lock was simple, a basic pin tumbler that yielded to his lockpick in under a minute. He slipped inside, his flashlight casting a narrow beam across the concrete floor. The garage smelled of motor oil and fresh paint, a familiar scent that grounded him even as his pulse raced. In the center stood Raymond's black SUV, its polished surface gleaming under the light, a symbol of the life Edward had been denied. He ran his fingers along the hood, the cool metal sending a shiver through him. In that moment, a plan began to take shape, born not of careful calculation, but of a raw, visceral need for retribution. He knew cars better than he knew people, their systems, their vulnerabilities, the way a single fault could turn a machine into a weapon. An accident, he thought, could be engineered to look blameless. A tragedy no one would question. Edward lingered in the garage only long enough to memorize its layout, noting the tools hanging on the wall and the spare tire in the corner. He didn't touch the SUV, not yet, but the seed of his plan took root. He slipped out as quietly as he'd entered, locking the door behind him and disappearing into the night. Back in his apartment, sleep remained elusive. Instead, he pulled a cardboard box from beneath his bed, its contents a relic of his early days as a mechanic when he dabbled in amateur pyrotechnics for car shows. Inside were old manuals on explosives, their pages brittle and stained, filled with diagrams of circuits and chemical compounds. He spread them across his kitchen table, the dim overhead light casting shadows over the schematics. His fingers traced the lines of a detonation circuit, his mind racing with possibilities. The thought of making Sarah and Raymond pay for their lies grew stronger, a fire that consumed his doubts. He didn't yet know the details of his plan, but the act of studying those pages felt like a step toward reclaiming control, toward rewriting the story of his betrayal. As the hours passed, Edward's apartment became a sanctuary of purpose. Tools he hadn't touched in years, wire cutters, soldering irons, a multimeter, joined the manuals on the table. He worked through the night, his hands moving with the same precision he brought to engine repairs. The city outside his window faded into a blur of lights and noise, irrelevant to the task at hand. By dawn, his eyes were bloodshot, his fingers cramped, but a blueprint was forming in his mind. He would build something precise, something devastating, something that would ensure Sarah and Raymond faced the consequences of their deception. The manuals offered a path, and Edward followed it, driven by a rage that felt both foreign and intimately his own. Edward's nights blurred into a relentless cycle of preparation, each one consumed by the meticulous task of crafting his instrument of vengeance. He had always been a man of precision, his hands steady as they rebuilt engines or aligned gears, but now those same hands turned to a darker purpose. He ventured into the underbelly of Los Angeles, navigating the shadowy corners of the black market where cash spoke louder than questions. In dimly lit back rooms and abandoned lots, he acquired the materials he needed: wires, timers, small quantities of explosive compounds, paying with crumpled bills and avoiding the gaze of security cameras. His movements were cautious, almost mechanical, as he slipped through the city like a ghost, leaving no trace of his transactions. The components he gathered were unremarkable on their own, but in his skilled hands they would become something lethal, a device powerful enough to obliterate a vehicle, yet compact enough to remain hidden beneath its undercarriage. Back in his Compton apartment, the space transformed into a clandestine workshop. The kitchen table, once cluttered with takeout containers, now held a sprawl of tools and schematics, the air thick with the metallic tang of solder and the faint, acrid scent of gunpowder. Every night, under the flicker of a single overhead bulb, Edward tested circuits, measured voltages, and refined the mechanism, his fingers moving with a surgeon's precision. His anger, a smoldering ember that had ignited with the DNA test results, now burned steadily, its heat mingling with the chemical fumes that filled the room. During the day, Edward maintained his vigil over Sarah and Raymond, his gray sedan a constant shadow trailing their routines. He memorized their schedules with an obsessive focus, noting the exact times they left their Pasadena home each morning. Sarah, in her crisp blouses, and Raymond, with his polished shoes and confident stride, climbed into their black SUV at precisely 7:15 a.m., driving to their respective workplaces after dropping Kayla at her elementary school. Edward's heart twisted each time he saw the girl, her backpack slung over one shoulder as she waved goodbye to Raymond. He told himself she was innocent, a child caught in the web of her mother's lies, and he resolved to ensure she would not be harmed. His plan hinged on precision. He would act on a day when Kayla stayed late at school for an after-hours program, leaving Sarah and Raymond alone in the vehicle. He studied their patterns for weeks, parking at different vantage points to avoid suspicion. A quiet street corner one day, a shaded lot near the school the next. Their lives unfolded before him like a script, predictable yet infuriating in its normalcy. The sight of their shared glances, the casual intimacy of their mornings, stoked the fire within him, each moment a reminder of the life they had stolen from him. As the days passed, Edward's plan took shape with chilling clarity. The bomb he crafted was a masterpiece of economy, its components hidden within a small metal casing, no larger than a shoebox. He tested its wiring repeatedly, ensuring the timer would trigger only when activated by a remote signal, a precaution that gave him control over the precise moment of detonation. Yet, even as he perfected the device, a flicker of doubt began to creep into his mind. In the quiet moments between his work, memories of Kayla surfaced unbidden, her tiny hand clutching his finger when she was an infant, the way her laughter had once filled their old apartment with light. He saw her face in his mind's eye, her eyes bright with trust, and wondered if she would ever understand the truth about her origins. These thoughts clashed with the rage that drove him, creating a storm within his heart. Sarah's betrayal loomed larger than his doubts, its weight crushing any hesitation. The years of alimony payments, the sacrifices he had made for a daughter who wasn't his, felt like a theft of his very soul, and he could not let it go unpunished. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Pasadena sky in shades of amber and crimson, Edward parked his sedan across from Sarah's home. Through the living room window, he saw her standing at the stove, stirring a pot with a familiar rhythm that tugged at his memory. For a fleeting moment, he was transported back to their shared life, to evenings when Sarah's humming filled their kitchen, when her laughter at his clumsy jokes had been enough to make him feel whole. The memory was vivid, her silhouette against the warm glow of the stove, the scent of her cooking mingling with the summer air. But now those images were tainted, poisoned by the knowledge of her infidelity. He watched her move, unaware of his gaze, and felt the weight of the detonator in his pocket, its cold metal grounding him in the present. He clenched it tightly, his knuckles whitening, and made a silent vow. This would be the last time he allowed the past to hold sway over him. He drove back to Compton under a starless sky, the city's lights blurring into streaks as his resolve solidified. The plan was set, the device nearly complete, and the moment of reckoning drew closer with every passing hour. The morning of August 15, 2018, dawned with a stillness that felt almost oppressive, the air heavy with the promise of another scorching Los Angeles day. Edward parked his gray sedan 3 blocks from Sarah and Raymond's Pasadena home, choosing a spot obscured by the overhanging branches of a jacaranda tree. The street was quiet, the neighborhood still cloaked in the pre-dawn twilight, its residents yet to stir. He pulled on a pair of thin black gloves, the latex clinging to his sweat-dampened hands, and retrieved a small canvas bag from the passenger seat. Inside lay the device he had spent weeks perfecting, its compact form a testament to his mechanical skill, its purpose a reflection of the rage that had consumed him. He moved swiftly, his footsteps silent on the pavement as he navigated the familiar path to their garage, his body low to avoid the glow of streetlights. The world around him seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a passing breeze. His heart pounded, but his hands remained steady, guided by years of muscle memory honed in the auto shop. The garage door loomed before him, its white paint chipped at the edges, a minor imperfection in the otherwise pristine facade of Sarah and Raymond's life. Edward knelt beside the side entrance, his toolkit tucked under his arm. The lock was the same simple mechanism he had breached before, and his lockpick slid into place with ease, the pins yielding under his practiced touch. The door opened with a soft click, and he slipped inside, closing it behind him. The garage was cool and dark, the air carrying the familiar scent of motor oil and rubber. Raymond's black SUV sat in the center, its polished surface catching the faint beam of Edward's flashlight as he swept it across the room. He approached the vehicle with the precision of a surgeon, setting his bag on the concrete floor and unzipping it to reveal the bomb. The device was a marvel of engineering, its components, wires, a digital timer, a small charge, encased in a metal shell no larger than a lunchbox. He opened the SUV's hood, the hinges creaking softly, and secured the device beneath the fuel tank. Its position carefully chosen to maximize destruction while remaining invisible to a casual inspection. His fingers moved deftly, connecting wires to the remote detonator, each motion deliberate and unhurried, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The task took less than 10 minutes, but each second stretched into an eternity, the silence of the garage amplifying the thud of his pulse. He checked the connections twice, ensuring no wire was loose, no component out of place, before closing the hood with a gentle thud. He stepped back, scanning the vehicle for any sign of his intrusion, but the garage remained as undisturbed as he had found it. Edward retraced his steps, locking the door behind him and slipping back to his sedan under the cover of darkness. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, the latex gloves slick with sweat. He sat in the driver's seat, the canvas bag now empty at his feet, and waited. The sky began to lighten, the first hints of dawn painting the horizon in shades of gray and gold. At exactly 7:30 a.m., the front door of the house opened, and Sarah and Raymond emerged. She wore a pale blue dress, her phone in hand, while he adjusted the collar of his jacket, his keys jangling as he unlocked the SUV. They climbed inside, oblivious to the device hidden beneath them, and pulled out of the driveway, the vehicle's taillights glowing red as they turned onto the main road. Edward started his engine, keeping a safe distance as he followed them onto the highway, his sedan blending into the morning traffic. His right hand rested on the detonator in his pocket, its weight both a comfort and a burden. His heart beat so loudly it seemed to drown out the hum of the engine, each thud a reminder of the irreversible step he was about to take. Through the SUV's rear window, he could see their silhouettes, Sarah scrolling on her phone, Raymond's hands steady on the wheel. The sight stirred memories of his wedding day, of Sarah's radiant smile as they danced under a canopy of stars, of the vows he had believed would bind them forever. Those promises, now hollow, fueled the fire in his chest, urging his thumb toward the detonator's button. The highway stretched ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the sprawling city. Edward maintained his distance, his eyes fixed on the SUV as it merged into the flow of commuters. The moment came suddenly, a split-second decision born of instinct rather than deliberation. His thumb pressed the button, and the world erupted. A deafening roar shattered the morning's calm, the SUV engulfed in a brilliant flash of orange and red. Flames licked the sky as the vehicle veered sharply, skidding across the highway before coming to a halt on the shoulder, a smoldering wreck of twisted metal and black smoke. Edward pulled over half a mile away, his sedan tucked behind a cluster of billboards. He watched as the first sirens wailed in the distance, their red and blue lights cutting through the haze of smoke rising from the wreckage. Emergency vehicles converged on the scene, their urgency a stark contrast to the stillness that had settled over Edward. He had expected a rush of relief, a sense of justice restored, but instead, a hollow emptiness gripped him. The act was done, his vengeance complete, yet the truth he had sought, the clarity he had hoped to find, felt further away than ever. The flames danced in the distance, a fleeting monument to his pain, but they offered no answers, only the weight of what he had become. The police arrived at the scene of the explosion within minutes, their flashing lights cutting through the haze of smoke that still hung over the highway. Investigators swarmed the charred remains of the black SUV, their gloved hands sifting through twisted metal and ash, collecting fragments that might explain the catastrophe. Edward's bomb, a product of his meticulous craftsmanship, had been designed to leave no obvious trace, its components incinerated in the blast or buried beneath the wreckage. Initial reports on the evening news labeled the incident a tragic accident, speculating about a fuel leak or a mechanical failure. Edward sat in his Compton apartment, the television's glow casting flickering shadows across the room as he listened to the anchor's measured voice. His eyes were fixed on the screen, but his thoughts drifted elsewhere, replaying the moment of detonation, the blinding flash, the roar that had echoed in his bones. He waited for the inevitable knock at his door, for the police to connect the dots back to him, but the days passed in an eerie silence, each one stretching longer than the last. The absence of suspicion should have brought relief, but instead, it left him suspended in a limbo of his own making, the weight of his actions pressing heavier with each uneventful sunrise. Word reached Edward through a mutual acquaintance that Kayla, now orphaned, had been taken in by Sarah's aunt, a woman who lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Pasadena. The news struck him with an unexpected pang, the first crack in the armor of his rage. He pictured Kayla's face, her wide eyes that he had once believed mirrored his own, her small hand clutching a stuffed animal during their rare visits. The realization that she was alone, stripped of both parents by his hand, stirred a guilt he hadn't anticipated. One overcast afternoon, driven by an impulse he couldn't fully explain, Edward drove to Kayla's school, parking across the street in his gray sedan. He sat there, hidden behind tinted windows, watching as children spilled out of the building, their laughter a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. When Kayla emerged, holding her aunt's hand, she looked smaller than he remembered, her shoulders hunched as if carrying a weight she couldn't name. Her braids swayed as she walked, her gaze fixed on the ground, and Edward felt a tightness in his chest. He wanted to step out, to speak to her, to offer some gesture of comfort, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. He had ensured her safety in his plan, but he hadn't accounted for the devastation his actions would leave in her life. The realization settled over him like ash, heavy and suffocating, that his quest for justice had shattered more than just his own pain. Sleep became a stranger to Edward in the nights that followed. He lay awake in his narrow bed, the darkness of his apartment broken only by the faint glow of streetlights seeping through the blinds. Images of the explosion haunted him, flames licking the sky, the SUV's frame collapsing into itself. Screams he hadn't heard but now imagined with vivid clarity. His mind conjured sounds that weren't there, echoes of anguish that seemed to emanate from within his own skull. Strange occurrences began to plague him, subtle at first but growing more unsettling with each passing day. A shadow flickered in the corner of his window, gone when he turned to look. Footsteps echoed outside his door, faint but deliberate, only to fade into silence when he checked the hallway. The air in his apartment carried a faint whiff of smoke, though he hadn't lit a cigarette in years. He tore through his belongings, checking the hidden compartment beneath his floorboards where he kept the tools, the detonator, and the tattered manuals he'd used to build the bomb. Everything was accounted for, untouched, yet the sense of being watched clung to him like damp clothing. He began to wonder if Sarah and Raymond had left something behind. A letter, a recording, a clue that could unravel his carefully laid plans. Or perhaps it was his own guilt, manifesting as a phantom presence, a specter born of the destruction he had wrought. Edward's days took on a mechanical rhythm, his movements driven by habit rather than purpose. He returned to the auto shop, his hands resuming their familiar tasks, but the work felt hollow, the clank of tools against metal, a dull echo of his former life. He avoided the television, unable to bear the sight of news reports that still lingered on the highway tragedy, though they offered no new developments. His nights were spent pacing the apartment, his eyes darting to the windows, the door, the corners where shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. He began to sleep with a knife under his pillow, its cold steel a small comfort against the unseen threat he couldn't name. The photograph of Kayla on his wall, once a source of bittersweet pride, now felt like an accusation, her smile a reminder of the life he had upended. He considered destroying the manuals, the tools, anything that tied him to the act, but something stopped him, a fear that erasing the evidence would only deepen his entanglement with the past. The city outside continued its relentless pulse, indifferent to his unraveling. But within the walls of his apartment, Edward was a prisoner of his own making, haunted by the ghosts of his choices and the truth he could no longer escape. A month slipped by, each day a slow erosion of the life Edward had once known. He returned to the auto shop, his hands resuming their familiar dance with wrenches and bolts. But the motions were hollow, stripped of the confidence that had once defined him. The clatter of tools against metal echoed in the cavernous garage, a sound that felt foreign, as if it belonged to someone else. He avoided newspapers and television, steering clear of the newsstands that lined the streets of Compton, but whispers of the investigation reached him through the grapevine of co-workers and barroom chatter. The police had begun to question the narrative of the highway explosion, their suspicions stirred by traces of explosives that didn't align with the story of a fuel leak. A detective, relentless and sharp-eyed, had taken charge of the case, piecing together fragments of evidence that pointed to foul play. Edward felt the invisible net tightening around him, each rumor a thread pulling him closer to discovery. In a fit of paranoia, he gathered the remnants of his plan, the tattered manuals, the soldering iron, the scraps of wire, and burned them in a metal trash can behind his apartment, watching the flames consume the last traces of his secret. The tools followed, dumped into a dumpster miles from home. But he knew these acts were futile, mere gestures against the tide of truth that was rising to engulf him. His nights grew heavier, the darkness of his apartment a mirror to the turmoil within. Sleep, when it came, was fitful, interrupted by dreams of fire and smoke, of Sarah's face dissolving into ash. One night a sound jolted him awake, a faint creak, like a floorboard yielding under weight. His heart raced as he grabbed the flashlight from his bedside table, its beam cutting through the shadows as he swept it across the room. The apartment was empty, the door locked, the windows undisturbed, yet the air felt charged as if someone had just slipped out of reach. He moved to the kitchen, his bare feet cold against the linoleum, and froze. On the table, where he had left nothing but a half-empty coffee mug, lay a photograph, its edges curled with age. It was from his wedding day, a moment captured in soft focus. Sarah in her white dress, her smile radiant, and beside her, Raymond, his arm brushing hers in a way that now seemed deliberate. Edward's breath caught as he turned the photo over, revealing a single word scrawled in black ink. Truth. Son. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the message cryptic, yet it pierced him with a certainty that this was no coincidence. He searched the apartment again, checking closets and under furniture, but found no sign of an intruder. The photograph remained, a silent sentinel on the table, its presence a harbinger of the reckoning he could no longer evade. The following morning the police arrived. Their knock was sharp, authoritative, echoing through the apartment like a gunshot. Edward opened the door to find a detective, his face lined with determination, flanked by two uniformed officers. The detective held a folder, its contents spilling out in precise, damning detail. Chemical traces from the explosion matching materials Edward had purchased. Grainy security footage of his rented sedan near Sarah's home. A timeline that aligned too perfectly with his movements. Edward stood motionless, his hands at his sides as the detective read his rights. He offered no resistance, no denial, his silence an admission of the truth he had tried to outrun. As the officers cuffed his wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin, he took a final look at his apartment, the chipped table, the faded car posters, the photograph of Kayla still hanging on the wall. Outside, Los Angeles sprawled under a gray sky, the city that had once been his home, now a distant memory. He realized as they led him to the patrol car that his pursuit of vengeance had not freed him from the past, but had bound him to it, a chain forged in fire and regret. Kayla grew up in the care of her aunt, her childhood shaped by absence and unanswered questions. She knew little of her mother, less of the man she had called father, and nothing of Edward, the stranger whose actions had rewritten her life. Her days were filled with school, with the soft hum of her aunt's sewing machine, with the quiet resilience of a child learning to navigate loss. Edward, confined to a cell in a county jail, spent his hours staring at the concrete ceiling, its cracks forming patterns that reminded him of flames. The trial loomed, a formality in the face of overwhelming evidence, but it held no meaning for him. The truth he had sought, the justice he had believed would heal him, had revealed itself to be a bitter, ashen thing, devoid of solace. It followed him into the cell, a constant companion in the silence, whispering of the lives he had shattered, of the daughter he had loved and lost, of the man he might have been. The city moved on, its rhythm unbroken, but Edward remained a solitary figure consumed by the fire he had ignited, its embers the only light in the darkness of his truth.